Got it set up?
I think I may be on. Okay, hello and welcome. My goodness, I apologize. The computer was not allowing access, and then I hadn't been before able to use my phone to go live. Unfortunately, I can't see people in the chat room. I just can only see what I see here. So, if you can see me, say hello, and then somebody else will comment. Maybe you can.
I just got a notification that you're on.
Okay, I am on live. Oh, I see you now. Okay, good. I see you. Perfect. My goodness. It's very difficult for me to understand technology here in the 19th century, as you can well imagine. Um, I, I have an iPhone. I don't know how to use an iPhone. It takes a lot of learning for me. However, more of the Baron coming right up. But before we do, how is everyone? Is everyone doing all right? Everyone feeling good? Everyone happy? I hope you're happy. Because life is a cabaret, old chum. Life is a cabaret. So for those of you who are joining, who are not welcome to, I mean, you're not familiar with the Baron Munchausin. We've been reading The Baron. It's a classic old novel. I'm doing well. Somebody just asked how I'm doing. I'm doing well. Turn of the 18th century into the 19th century. So here we are, more of the Baron. It's exciting, no? Well, let's see. Now, last week we left it off at chapter 13, and we pick up again on chapter 14. Baron de Tott, in his memoirs, makes as great a parade of single act as many travelers whose whole lives have been spent in seeing the different parts of the globe. For my part, if I had been blown from Europe to Asia, from the mouth of a cannon, from the mouth of a cannon, I should have boasted less of it afterwards than he has done of only firing off a Turkish piece of ordnance. What he says of this wonderful gun, as near as my memory will serve me, is this. The Turks had placed below the castle, and near the city on the banks of the Simois, a celebrated river, an enormous piece of an ordnance cast in brass, which would carry a marble ball of 1,100 pounds weight. I was inclined, says Tott, to fire it, but I was willing first to judge of its effect. The crowd about me trembled at this proposal, as they asserted it would be overthrown not only the castle, but also the city. At length their fears in part subsided, and I was permitted to discharge it. It required not less than 330 pounds weight of powder, and the ball weighed, as before mentioned, 1,100 weight. When the engineer brought the priming, the crowds who were about me were retreated back as fast as they could. Nay, it was with the utmost difficulty I persuaded the Pasha, who came on purpose. There was no danger. Even the engineer, who was to discharge it by my direction, was considerably alarmed. I took my stand on some stonework behind the cannon, gave the signal, and felt a shock like that of an earthquake. At the distance of 300 fathom, the ball burst into three pieces. The fragments crossed the strait, rebounded on the opposite mountain, and left the surface of the water all in a foam through the whole breadth of the channel. This, gentlemen, is, as near as I can recollect, Baron Tott's account of the largest cannon in the known world. Now, when I was there, not long since the antecedents of Tott's firing, this tremendous piece was mentioned as proof of the gentleman's extraordinary courage. I was determined not to be outdone by a Frenchman. Therefore, took this very piece upon my shoulder, and after balancing it properly, jumped into the sea with it, and swam to the opposite shore, from whence I, unfortunately, attempted to throw it back into its former place. I say unfortunately, for it slipped a little in my hand, just as I was going to discharge it. And in consequence of that, it fell into the middle of the channel, where it now lies, without prospect of ever recovering it. And notwithstanding the high favour I was in with the Grand Signor, as before mentioned, this cruel Turk, as soon as he heard of the loss of his famous piece of ordnance, issued an order to cut off my head. I was immediately informed of it by one of the sultanas, with whom I was become a great favourite, and she secreted me in her apartment while the officer charged with my execution was, with his assistance, in search of me. That very night I made my escape on board a vessel bound to Venice, which was then weighing an anchor to proceed on her voyage. The last story, gentlemen, I am not fond of mentioning, as I miscarried in the attempt, and was very near losing my life into the bargain. However, as it contains no impeachment of my honour, I would not withhold it from you. Now, gentlemen, you all know me, and can have no doubt of my veracity. I will entertain you with the origin of this same swaggering, bouncing tot. His reputed father was native of Bern, in Switzerland. His profession was that of surveyor of the streets, lanes, and alleys, vulgarly called scavenger. His mother was a native of the mountains of Savoy, and had a most beautiful large wen on her neck, common to both sexes in that part of the world. She left her parents when the young sought her fortune in the same city which gave his father birth. She maintained herself while single by acts of kindness to our sex, for she never is known to refuse them any favour they asked, provided they did but pay her some compliment beforehand. This lovely couple met quite by accident in the street in consequence of their being both intoxicated. For by reeling to one centre, they threw each other down. This created mutual abuse, in which they were complete adepts. They were both carried to the watch house, and afterwards to the house of correction. They soon saw the folly of quarrelling, and made it up, became fond of each other, and married. But Madam returning to her old tricks, his father, who had high notions of honour, soon separated himself from her. She then joined the family, who strolled about with a puppet show. In time she arrived at Rome, where she kept an oyster stand. You have all heard, no doubt, of the Pope Ganganelli, commonly called Clement XIV. He was remarkably fond of oysters. One Good Friday, as he was pushing through his famous city in the state to assist at High Mass at St. Peter's Church, he saw this woman's oysters, which were remarkably fine and fresh. He could not proceed without tasting them. There were about 5,000 people in this train, and he ordered them all to stop. And he sent word to the church he could not attend Mass till next day. Then alighting from his horse, for the Pope always rides on horseback upon these occasions, he went into her stall and ate every oyster she had, and afterwards retired into the cellar, where she had a few more. This subterraneous apartment was her kitchen, parlour, and bedchamber. He liked his situation this much, that he discharged all of his attendants, and, to make a short story, His Holiness passed the night there. I'm certain for you adults I don't have to spell out the situation in which Pope Clement found himself. I am going to remove this pillow, however, because I use it sometimes as a book prop, but I had to turn off the fan, and it is quite warm. So, I digress. Chapter the 15th. I omitted several very material parts in my father's journey across the English Channel to Holland, which, that they may not be totally lost, I will now faithfully give you in his own words, as I heard him relate them to his friends several times. On my arrival, says my father, at Helvoetsluys, I was observed to breathe with some difficulty. Upon the inhabitants inquiring into the cause, I informed them that the animal upon whose back I rode from Harwich across to their shore did not swim. Such is their peculiar form and disposition that they cannot float or move upon the surface of the water. He ran with incredible swiftness upon the sands from the shore to shore, driving fish in the millions before him, many of which were quite different from any I had yet seen, carrying their heads at the extremity of their tails. I crossed, continued he, one prodigious range of rocks equal in height to the Alps. The tops or the highest part of these marine mountains are said to be upwards of 100 fathoms below the surface of the sea, and the sides of which there were great variety of tall, noble trees, loaded with marine fruit, such as lobsters, crabs, oysters, scallops, mussels, cockles, etc., 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 some of which were cartload singly, and none less than a potter's. All these which are brought on the shore and sold in the markets are of inferior dwarf kind, or properly waterfalls, i.e. fruits, shook off the branches of the tree it grows upon, by the motion of the water. As those in our gardens are by the wind, the lobster tree appeared the richest, but the crab and the oysters were the tallest. The periwinkle, a kind of shrub, it grows at the foot of the oyster tree and twines around it as the ivy does the oak. I observed the effect of several accidents by shipwreck and etc., particularly a ship that had been wrecked by striking against a mountain or rock, of the top of which lay within 3 fathoms of the surface. As she sank, she fell upon her side, and then keeled a very large lobster tree out of its place. It was in the spring, when the lobsters were very young, and many of them being separated by violence of the shock, they fell upon the crab tree which was growing below them. They have, like a farina of plants, intuned and produced a fish resembling both. I endeavoured to bring one with me, but it was too cumbersome, and my saltwater Pegasons seemed much displeased at every attempt to stop his career, whilst I continued upon his back. Besides, I was then, though galloping over a mountain of rocks that lay about midway the passage, at least 500 fathoms below the surface of the sea, and began to find the want of air inconvenient. Therefore, I had no inclination to prolong the time. Add to this, my situation was in other respects very unpleasant. I met many large fish who were, if I could judge by their open mouths, not only able, but really wished to devour us. Now, as my Rosinate was blind, I had these hungry gentlemen's attempts to guard against in addition to my other difficulties. As we drew near the Dutch shore, and the body of the water over the heads did not exceed 20 fathoms, I thought I saw a human figure in female dress, then lying on sand before me with some signs of life. Then I came close. I perceived her hand move. I took it into mine and brought her to onto the shore as a corpse. An apothecary who had just been instructed by Dr. House. The Baron's father must have lived very lately if Dr. House was his preceptor of London, treated her properly, and she recovered. She was the rib of a man who commanded a vessel belonging to the Voyage. He was just going out of port on a voyage, when she, hearing he had got a mistress with him, followed him in an open boat. As soon as she'd got on the quarter-deck, she flew at her husband, and attempted to strike him with such impetuosity that he thought it most prudent to slip on one side, and let her make the impression of the fingers upon the waves rather than his face. He was not much out he was not much out in his ideas of the consequence, for meeting no opposition, she went directly overboard, and it was my unfortunate lot to lay the foundation for bringing this happy pair together again. I can easily conceive that the exaggerations the husbands loaded with me when, on his return, they found his gentle creature waiting his arrival, and learned the mean by which she came into the world again. However, great as the injury is which I have done, this poor devil, I hope he will die in charity with me, as my motive was good, though the consequence to him are, it must be confessed, rather horrible. Chapter 16. On my return to Gibraltar, I travelled by way of France to England. Being a foreigner, this was not attended with any inconvenience to me. I found in the harbour of Calais a ship just arrived, with a number of English sailors as prisoners of war. I immediately conceived an idea of giving these brave followers their liberty, which I accomplished as follows. After forming a pair of large wings, each of them 40 yards long and 14 wide, annexing them into myself, I mounted at break of day, when every creature, even watch upon deck, was fast asleep. Deck. These words, and I'm old. Everyone was upon deck was fast asleep. As I hovered over the ship, I fastened 3 grappling irons on top of the 3 masts, which with my shrug, and fairly lifted her several yards out of the water, and then proceeded across to Dover, where I arrived in half an hour. Having no further occasion for these wings, I made them present to the governor of Dover Castle, when they were now exhibited to the curious. As to the prisoners and the Frenchmen who guarded them, they did not wake till they had been near 2 hours on Dover Pier. The moment the English understood their situation, they changed places with their guard, and took back what they had been plundered of. But no more, for they were too generous to retaliate and plunder them in return. Chapter 17. In a voyage which I made to the sea in the East Indies with Captain Hamilton, I took a favourite pointer with me. It was to use as common phrase, worth his weight in gold, for he never deceived one. One day, when we were by the best of observations we could make, at least 300 leagues from land, my dog pointed. I observed him for near an hour with astonishment, and mentioned the circumstance to the captain and every officer on board, asserting that we must be near land, for my dog smelt game. This occasioned a general laugh, but that did not alter in the least the good opinion I had of my dog. After much conversation pro and con, I boldly told the captain I placed more confidence in Trey's nose than I did in the eyes of every seaman aboard, and therefore boldly proposed laying the sum I had agreed to pay for my passage, viz. 100 guineas, that we should find game within half an hour. The captain, a good hearty fellow, laughed again, desired Mr. Crawford, the surgeon, who was prepared to feel my pulse. He did so, and reported me in perfect health. The following dialogue between them took place. I overheard it, though spoken low and at some distance. Captain. His brain is turned. I cannot with honour accept his wager. Surgeon. I am of a different opinion. He is quite sane, and depends more upon the scent of his dog than he will upon the judgment of all of the officers on board. He will certainly lose, and he richly, the word is messed up, and the richly, I guess it would be inherits it. He will certainly lose, and he richly inherits it. Captain. Such a wager cannot be fair on my side. However, I'll take him up if I return his money afterwards. During the above conversation, Trey continued in the same situation, and confirmed me still more in my former opinion. I proposed the wager a second time. It was then, of course, accepted. Done and done were scarcely said on both sides, when some sailors who were fishing in the longboat, which made fast to the stern of the ship, harpooned an exceedingly large shark, which they brought on board and began to cut up for the purpose of barreling the oil, when, behold, they found on no less than 6 brace of live partridges in this animal's stomach. They had been there so long in that situation that one of the hens was sitting upon 4 eggs, and a 5th was hatching when the shark was opened. This young bird was brought up by placing it with the litter of kittens that came into the world a few minutes before. The old cat was as fond of it as any of her own 4-legged progeny, and made herself very unhappy when it flew out of her reach till it returned again. As to the other partridges, there were 4 hens among them. One or more were during the voyage constantly sitting, and consequently we had plenty of game at the captain's table. And in gratitude to poor Tray for being the means of winning 100 guineas, I ordered him the bones daily, and sometimes a whole bird. Chapter the 18th. I have already informed you of one trip I have made to the moon in search of my silver hatchet. I afterwards made another in much pleasanter manner, and stayed in so long enough to take notice of the several things which I will endeavour to describe, as accurately as my memory will permit. I went on a voyage of discovery, at the request of a distant relation, who had a strange notion that there were people to be found equal in magnitude to those described by Gulliver in the empire of Brodinag. For my part, I always treated that account as fabulous. However, to oblige him, for he had made me the heir, I undertook it, and sailed for the South Seas, where we arrived without meeting with anything remarkable except some flying men and women who were playing leapfrog and dancing minuets in the air. On the 18th day, after we had passed the island of Ochiti, mentioned by Captain Cook as the place from whence they brought Omi, a hurricane blew over our ship, at least 1,000 leagues above the surface of the water, and kept it at that height till the fresh gale arising filled the sails in every part. And onward we travelled at prodigious rate. Thus we proceeded above the clouds for 6 weeks. At last we discovered a great land in the sky, like a shining island, round and bright, where, coming into a convenient harbour, we went on shore, and soon found it was inhabited. Below us we saw another earth, containing cities, trees, mountains, rivers, seas, etc., 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 which we conjectured was this world which we had left. Here we saw huge figures riding upon vultures of prodigious size, and each of them having 3 heads. To form some idea of the magnitude of these birds, I must inform you that each of their wings is as wide and 6 times the length of the main sheet of our vessel, which was about 600 tons burdened. Thus, instead of riding upon horses, as we do in this world, the inhabitants of the moon, for now we have found we were in Madame Luna, fly about us on the birds. The king, we found, was engaged in war with the sun, and he offered me commission. But I declined the honour his majesty intended me. Everything in this world is extraordinarily magnitude, a common flea being much larger than one of our sheep. In making war, their principal weapons are radishes, which are used as darts. Those who are wounded by them die immediately. Their shields are made of mushrooms, and their darts, when radishes are out of season, are the tops of asparagus. Some of the natives of the Dog Star are to be seen here. commerce tempts them to ramble. Their faces are like large mastiffs, with their eyes near the lower end of the tip of their noses. They have no eyelids, but cover their eyes with the end of their long tongues when they go to sleep. They are generally 20 feet high. As to the natives of the moon, none of them are lesser stature than 36 feet. They are not called the human species, but the cooking animals, for all dress their food by fire, as we do, but lose no time at their meals, as they open their left side and place the whole quantity at once in their stomach. Then shut it again until the same day in the next month. For they never indulge themselves with food more than 12 times a year, or once a month. All but gluttonous and epicures must prefer this method to ours. There is but one sex either of cooking or any other animals in the moon. They are all produced from trees of various size and foliage. That which produces the cooking animal, or human species, is much more beautiful than any of the other. It has large straight boughs, with flesh-colored leaves, and the fruit it produces are nuts or pods with hard shells at least 2 yards long. Then they become ripe, which is known from their changing color. They are gathered with great care and laid by as long as they think proper. When they choose to animate the seed of these nuts, they grow them into a cauldron of boiling water, which opens the shells in a few hours, and out jumps the creatures. Nature forms their minds for different pursuits before they come into this world. From one shell comes forth a warrior, and another a philosopher, and a third a divine, from a fourth a lawyer, from a fifth a farmer, a sixth a clown, and etc., 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 and each of them immediately begin to perfect themselves by practicing what they before knew only in theory. When they grow old, they do not die, but turn into air and dissolve like smoke. As for their drink, they need none. The only evacuations they have are insensible, and by their breath. They have but one finger upon each hand, and with each they perform every tiding in the perfect manner as we do, who have 4 besides the thumb. Their heads are placed under their right arm, and when they are going to travel or about any violent exercise, they generally leave them at home, or they can consult them at any distance. This is a very common practice, and when those of rank or quality among the Lunarians have inclination to see what's going forward among the common people, they stay at home, i.e., the body stays at home, and sends the head only, which is suffered to be present and return at pleasure with an account of what has passed. The stones of their grapes are exactly like hail, and I am perfectly satisfied that when a storm or high wind in the moon shakes their vines and breaks the grapes from the stalks, the stones fall down and form our hail showers. I would advise those who are of my opinion to have a quantity of these stones when it hails next, and make a Lunarian wine. It is common beverage at St. Luke's. Some material circumstances I have nearly omitted. They put their bellies to the same use as we do a sack, and throw whatever they have occasion for into it, for they can shut and open it again when they please, as they do their stomachs. They are not troubled with bowels, liver, heart, or any other intestines. Neither are they encumbered with clothes, nor is there any part of their bodies unseemly or undecent to exhibit. Their eyes they can take in and out of their place when they please, and can see as well with them in their hands as in their heads. And if by any accident they lose or damage one, they can borrow or purchase another, and see as clearly with it as their own. Dealers in eyes are now on that account very numerous in most parts of the moon, and In this article alone, all inhabitants are whimsical. Sometimes green and sometimes yellow eyes are fashion. I know these things appear strange, but if the shadow of doubt can remain of any person's mind, I say let him take voyage there himself, and then he will know that I am a traveller of veracity. I believe we shall end there, my darlings. I know it is only half an hour, but I believe we shall end there. We will pick up next week. Oh yes, we're about halfway through the book, so that's exciting. Thank you so much for joining me. Check out my latest video we did on cleansing the pendulums. Debbie, you are here. You are the one who created those. Thank you so much. We've got some other great stories in the works for you, my lovelies. Until then, I love you. Take care. Good night. I don't know how to end it, by the way.